Good afternoon and welcome to Mesa Refuge. Our program this afternoon is Research Rapture, Using Archives to Tell New Stories. I'm Elaine Ellinson. I'm a proud alum of Mesa Refuge Writing Residency and currently president of the board. And I'm so thrilled about the lineup of Mesa Refuge authors we have to share their experiences with you today. For those of you who are first-time visitors to Mesa Refuge, we are a writing residency located in Point Reyes Station, just north of San Francisco, and our focus is on supporting writers who focus on three issues: the environment, economic equity, and social justice. In our 22 years, we have hosted more than 900 writers in every genre. As all of you, we have been enduring this difficult year of the COVID pandemic, the economic crisis, and the tumultuous political situation. And as we have had to partially limit our real-time programs, we have, inspired by our wonderful executive director, Susan Tillett, inaugurated a series of panels and discussions that we call From the Gathering Room. All of our alums who participate have graciously donated their time to share their ideas and experiences. My co-host for today, Laura Atkins, and I found that many writers, from journalism to poetry, have at times found themselves in research rapture. It is loosely defined as this: the delightful but dangerous condition of being repeatedly sidetracked in following intriguing threads of information or constantly searching for one more elusive fact. But I'm sure all of you writers out there and the archivists and librarians who have helped us all so much know exactly what we mean. That's why we thought it would be a great topic for discussion today. After our panelists each give a presentation about their work, we will have time for questions. So please put your questions in the chat and we will try to get to as many as possible. And now I want to introduce my co-host, Laura Atkins, who will introduce the rest of the panel. Laura is a children's book author, editor, and teacher. She co-wrote Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, with San Yogi, winner of several awards, and they have presented that book to over 8,000 students. She also co-wrote Biddy Mason Speaks Up with poet Arisa White, which won both a Novelist and Independent Publisher Book Award. She has an MA in Children's Literature and an MFA in Writing for Children and Young Adults and lives in Berkeley with her 13-year-old and their dog. Laura, take it from here.
Thank you, Elaine, and good afternoon, everyone. It's such a delight to be here and take part in today's event. I wanted to thank the wonderful Elaine Ellinson for the introduction and kind of joining with me in pulling this event together. And I also wanted to thank the team at the Mesa Refuge. Many of you will know Susan Tillett, Kira Epstein, and Kamala Tully, who are helping to keep everything moving, all the moving parts. And a special thanks to the panelists who've shown up today. I'm going to give everyone a longer introduction before they speak, but I want to just say briefly, welcome. And we've decided to go in reverse alphabetical order just for something a little bit different, which means Stan, for the first time in his life, gets to go first. So we have San Yogi, who is a historian and author of nonfiction for adults and children. Elaine Ellinson, also a historian, really all of us are, and an author of nonfiction and fiction for adults. Sara Campos is a writer of fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. And Susan Anderson, a master historian and an author of poetry and nonfiction. So we are in for quite a treat. The first speaker, as I said, will be Stan. San Yogi is the co-author with Elaine Ellinson, are here, of Wherever There's a Fight, and co-author with myself of Fred Korematsu Speaks Up. He's currently researching and writing a book on progressive Christians in the U.S. and their involvement in the struggles for LGBTQ plus equality, reproductive freedom, immigrants' rights, and racial justice. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Elaine, both of you, for organizing today's panel and for inviting me to participate. And thank all of you in Zoom land who are joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion of craft and how to incorporate research findings into our work. So I am going to be talking about my current project, which Laura just described, and that was inspired by the book that Elaine and I co-wrote, which I hope you can see my screen now, Wherever There's a Fight, and that was published 11 years ago. And there was a story that we wrote about in the LGBTQ chapter of Wherever There's a Fight that really inspired my current project. And that story was about the police raid of a 1965 fundraising event held by an organization called the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, which consisted of clergy and leaders of lesbian and gay organizations in San Francisco. And this was, remember, 1965, so more than 50 years ago, close to 60 years ago now. And after working on Wherever There's a Fight, or during working on Wherever There's a Fight, I thought, wow, if this happened in 1965, there must be other instances when Christians were on the progressive side of some of these controversial issues that Laura mentioned that are the subject of my book. So I began working on this book a couple of years ago, but the idea for it came up, at least 10 years ago. But the book took on more urgency in the past 4 years, after 80% of white evangelicals have steadfastly stood behind Trump. And it's just been difficult for me to wrap my mind around how they can reconcile Christian values with the personality and personal actions of Trump, as well as his policies. So this book project is really meant in part to counter the juggernaut of right-wing Christians who seem to have hijacked Christianity and have twisted the meaning of it, and to show that there were examples in our not too distant past when Christians took stands in favor of LGBTQ equality, reproductive freedom, immigrants' rights, and racial justice. So I had to do archival research for this, and the background is that although I was raised a Christian, I don't have a really deep history in Christianity. So the first year of working on this book was really just doing some background reading to kind of get a lay of the land, so that when I start interviewing people, I'm not deer in the headlights. You're like, what do you mean by that? I don't know what you mean. So fortunately for me, I focused on the LGBTQ chapter for the last year. And fortunately for me, the largest repository of LGBTQ historical materials is about 2 miles from where I live. I live in downtown LA. And so this is the One Archives, which is affiliated with USC, the exterior and the interior. And the One Archives is built on the collection of one of the founders of One magazine, which is shown here on the right, which was published between 1953 and 1967. So when I do archival research, I usually have a loose agenda. So I know that there are materials or collections at an archives that I want to look at. And so there are specific things that specific files or records that I want to look at. But I also try to keep an open mind because, as Elaine said in the introduction, there's that rapturous moment where you come across something that you didn't know existed or takes you in a kind of different direction. So I approach archival research from a couple of perspectives as somebody who writes history. And so my philosophy in writing history is to really tell the history through the stories of individuals and through incidents, because I believe that most people will remember those stories and those incidents and those personalities. And hopefully in remembering those stories, they'll remember the larger kind of historical arc and lessons. So when I do archival research, I'm really looking at archives through two different lenses. One is to help me to develop the pillars of the arc of a story. So I'm kind of approaching the writing from the perspective of a fiction writer, trying to tell an arc of a story. And I'm looking in archives for some of those foundational pillars, or in fictional terms, plot points. But I'm also looking for some telling details that will illustrate and bring to life the stories. So there could be an arc to the whole book, there can be an arc to a chapter, and there could be mini arcs within a chapter. So I'm going to talk about a little mini arc within the LGBTQ chapter about the Council on Religion and the Homosexual. So when I started doing research for this book, I knew a little bit about the history of the council and a little bit about what they did, but not much. So I really needed to find those pillars in terms of the genesis of the council and then what they did. So I found in the One Archives of this publication that the council issued soon after the council held a 3-day retreat in Marin County that involved clergy and LGBT, or I guess it was L and G at that point, group leaders in San Francisco. So this was kind of a little mini gold mine because I got a sense of who was involved, motivations for the founding of the council. And then I have this list or partial list of participants. And this was helpful because I was then able to identify people that I could do more research on, and if they're still living, to try to interview. And I actually interviewed one of the people who participated in the founding retreat of the council. I also discovered in the archives that the council in San Francisco spawned similar groups throughout the country, including here in Los Angeles, in Washington, D.C., in Boston, but in more unlikely places, or to me, more unlikely places like Lincoln, Omaha, Nebraska, and Kansas City, Missouri. So the document here on the left is from the archives of the Southern California Council on Religion and the Homophile, which describes its founding. And the document here on the right is from the One Archives as well, from the records of this North American Conference on Homophile Organizations, or NACHO, which was a collective group or an umbrella group for these organizations that existed around the country. And that was kind of a surprise to me that these organizations even existed in the 60s, and that they were all over the country, and that they were organized in this kind of umbrella group. So this was another pillar for this chapter that helped me to identify groups that I want to do further research on. I also want to talk about telling details. So this is a flyer for that ball, that fundraising event that the police raided. And this was helpful for me because I can describe this flyer, because I knew that it was, the dance was advertised in bars, which was the few places at the time where gay people could gather. So I could describe this as being the flyer that was posted in the bars. But also some of the details are really intriguing to me, like the timing of the dance was from 9 to 2, which parallels the kind of peak hours that folks would go to a bar. I was also intrigued that they were selling tickets up to 1,500. So the fact that they thought they could get 1,500 people to attend this event was like really kind of eye-opening to me. And also that no tickets would be available at the door. This reinforced the idea, which I read in other sources, that this was going to be a private event, because police could raid a public place like a bar, but theoretically they couldn't raid a private event. So the fact that the police shut down this event was really telling and helpful for a legal case that was eventually brought challenging the police actions. Since we're in this age of COVID, I want to point out online archives as well. So I haven't been able to go to the One Archives, but I've been able to take advantage of some online archives, both for pillar foundational points, but also for details. So this is one of those archives. It's the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network. And they have profiles, like little biographies of people. And so I've identified specific folks that I want to research. And this is a biography here on the right of one of those clergy people that I want to write about. I was involved in the founding of CRH, but also was involved with the council here in Southern California as well. So these bios provide really helpful information. I'm hopefully going to interview the widow of this clergy person, Clay Colwell. And the Religious Archives Network also includes this online exhibit, or several online exhibits. And this one is specifically about the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, and was, again, a treasure trove of archival materials, including oral history interviews with participants in the founding of the council, in the raid. It was in this exhibit that I heard, I believe, in an oral history interview about Reverend Clay Colwell, who I just discussed or showed a slide of earlier, and how when the police raided the event, there were police photographers outside of the hall where the event was taking place. And Reverend Colwell and his wife would escort people who were attending the event out of the hall and would open their jackets to shield the participants in the dance from the police officers who were taking photographs of them. So that kind of detail is like really telling to me about them as people, but I also hopefully to the reader will bring the story alive. So I'm going to stop there and pass the baton back to Laura so she can introduce the next panelist.
Great. Thank you very much, Stan. You got us going beautifully. And we're going to move on now to Elaine Ellinson, who is, we have a lot of intermixing here, the co-author with San Yogi of Wherever There's a Fight, How Runaway Slaves, Suffragists, Immigrants, Strikers, and Poets Shaped Civil Liberties in California, which won a 2010 gold medal in the California Book Awards. She was a journalist in Southeast Asia with Pacific News Service and the former editor of the ACLU News. Elaine is currently working a book reviewer for the Los Angeles Review of Books, the San Francisco Chronicle, and other publications, and is working on a novel based on her grandmother's diaries that I think we're about to hear more about. So welcome, Elaine.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you, Stan, for that presentation. Stan was the best co-author I could wish for, and I'm sure Laura would agree with me on that one. I am going to talk about the book I'm working on now, which is about based on my grandmother's diaries, but we were also asked if we wanted to mention something that happened to us at Mesa Refuge, and I wanted just to share a mini story about that. Like many who came to Mesa, I was coming to write. I had piles of research that I had brought with me, and I was unsure of the internet connection being out in, West Marin or the library. So I was really planning not to do research, but to write. Yet I would walk down to the Point Reyes Library a couple of times a week, especially to read the New York Times, truth be told, for the crossword puzzle. But one day I was browsing through the Marin history section just to get a better sense of where I was. And I came across a monograph by Charles Wallenberg, which was about Marin ship called Marin at War. I think it was a document that had been commissioned by the government to document the history of shipbuilding during World War II, because Marin ship was one of the major shipbuilding places that grew up during the World War II. And I started thumbing through it, and I found the most amazing story of Joseph James, who was an African-American labor organizer and shipbuilder who challenged the race bar that was imposed both by the company, Marin Ship, and also the Boilermakers Union, which kind of controlled the hiring at the company. It was a struggle I knew nothing about, and perhaps most Marin residents didn't either, but it was a really important movement that led to the involvement of hundreds of Black ship workers. Marin Independent called it Marin's greatest labor demonstration. There was a lawsuit where the Black workers were actually represented by Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP, and a California Supreme Court decision declaring in 1945 that the restrictions on Jim Crow membership and employment was, quote, discriminatory and unequal. And that became one of the main stories in our section on labor in Wherever There's a Fight. So it was a very serendipitous moment. And so today I just wanted to share some stories about the book I'm working on now, which is based on my grandmother's diaries. This is a picture of my grandmother. She is the woman with the hat and the suitcase on the left, and that's her sister. And I'll tell you why I have this picture in a moment. We were asked to look at both the joys and the challenges of research, and I'm going to share two stories about this book with you. We discovered my grandmother's diaries, which were written from 1905 to 1918, long after she had died. It was actually after my mom had died, and we found them in my mom's papers. They were written in Yiddish and a little bit in Russian. So we couldn't read them. There were 5 notebooks covered with kind of a faux leather crumbling cover, written mostly in pencil on thick yellowing paper. Now, my father could read Yiddish, but he could not read these because of the writing was very obscure. So my brother, who I hope is on this call today, he's a klezmer musician, and he was tied into sort of the Yiddishkeit world in New York. He reached out to Yiddish translators who quoted us, prices per page, per hour, etc. And then, so this is kind of like what my grandmother's diaries looked like. And my brother sent out some pages to translators, and little by little, they started coming back. They also could not read it. My grandmother had very little schooling, so the words and the grammar were not clear. They were written mostly in pencil, which had faded over the decades. And Yiddish has no capital letters, so it was hard to say, what was a proper noun or name of a town. So we found that we had to send them these pages to a decipherist. What is a decipherist? A decipherist is a trade that grew up actually after World War II to translate the Yiddish memories of people who were in shtetls that had been wiped out by the Nazis. So they would take the handwritten materials that were written by children and elderly people and uneducated people and read them through and turn them into Yiddish print, which would then look like this. And, you read Yiddish from right to left. So this is how we then got the pages back. So once the decipherist took the pages, then we could send them to the translators. And that unlocked a whole treasury of stories. Her life in the shtetl, coming to Chicago, working in a sweatshop, spending 6 months in a TB sanitarium, and most importantly, a very beautiful poetic voice that she spoke in. And that is why we decided, I decided with my brothers and my cousins to write a book based on her diaries. Now, in many ways, my grandmother's story was typical of the 3 million Jewish immigrants who came to America in the early 20th century. But it differed greatly in one respect, and that was another point about my research rapture. When she was 20, she decided to go back to Russia in 1910, and she spent 1.5 years there. And this is a portrait in a studio that was taken of her on her way. She was 20, her sister was 14. You can see the suitcase has nothing in it. It's a staged photo, from a photography studio because it's so light. She's holding it with just a couple of fingers. And you can see she's like really anxious to leave. She's even getting out of that picture. And her sister is like, why aren't you taking me with you? So she went back to Russia at age 20. That's a ship manifest, I'm sorry. And we don't have hardly any record of that time. There were very few pages written from that time. But here is a memory book that's written in both Yiddish and Russian. And I know some Russian, so I was able to translate some of the Russian, but there's very, very few pages. And of course, part of that was because it was a pre-revolutionary time, and she was a member of the Socialist Jewish Labor Bund, which was a revolutionary organization. It was also a fascinating time because it was a time when Jews were actually welcomed into the revolutionary socialist parties, but they also became targets of the Tsar after the assassination in 1911 of Prime Minister Stolypin. So my research took a different turn because I didn't have her actual report of that. So I had to look at Russian and Yiddish left-wing newspapers of the time. And I also found a book at the Yiddish Book Center that had pictures of the Jewish prisoners. These are some Jewish prisoners, revolutionary prisoners, political prisoners in Siberia. You can see there's some women in the second row. And my favorite picture of a woman in Siberia in prison. And I've based a lot of the story, fictionalized, just imagined, on a woman that she knew who was a revolutionary who was imprisoned there. So again, there was a problem, but it turned into a rapture because it led me to other kinds of research. And we have, through her diaries, unlocked what I think is a very moving story. So with that, I will end and turn it back to Laura.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elaine. That's wonderful. Now we've had nonfiction and fiction research, so we're getting a nice array, and we're going to move on to Sara Campos, who is a writer, lawyer, and program officer at a private family foundation. After decades of immigrant advocacy, she obtained an MFA in creative writing from Mills College. She has published fiction, poetry, and nonfiction in a number of publications, including St. Anne's Review, Rio Grande Review, Color Lines, Literary Mama, Alternate Media, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Wandering Songs, Central American Writing in the United States. Welcome, Sara. You're muted, Sara.
Unmute myself. Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me and not the construction that's happening outside. So my novel, and first of all, I'd like to thank all of you who are participating in this, Elaine for putting it together, and of course, our wonderful staff at Mesa Refuge. So my novel involves historical fiction set in Guatemala from the 30s to 1954. And it's a time of, it's a very tumultuous time. In the 30s, Guatemala had been saddled with this really brutal dictator for about 13 years. And in 1944, students toppled this dictator and the country ushered in democratic rule, which lasted 10 years. Only to be again toppled by our government. In 1954, our government staged a coup that ousted the president who'd been democratically elected, and the country plunged into conflict that later led to a 36-year war, civil war. But that's just the backdrop, the historical backdrop for my novel. The book is essentially a love story between an indigenous man and a white woman who meet as children and later fall in love and become involved in land reform during the 10-year rule. And although times are changing in Guatemala, Mayan indigenous people have been subjugated as a caste. And my protagonist's relationship would have been taboo, as well as an affront to Guatemalan society at the time. So I started with the question of how a young woman in Guatemala would have fallen in love with an indigenous man. And I decided she must have had to have come from somewhere else. If she'd been raised in Guatemala, she probably would not have seen a young Native man as a love interest. She wouldn't have seen him other than as a peasant or a worker, or no one within her class would have, married this young peasant. And I knew this because my mother's Guatemalan, and I had traveled to Guatemala as a girl and a teen, and I heard the racist talk about indigenous people, very much like the racism here in our own country. So I thought about where would she have come from, and I ended up focusing on Spain because of the troubles they had. They were in the midst of their civil war in the 30s. And from my reading, I realized that the exodus of Spain from of refugees flowed into the Dominican Republic and to Mexico, and I found very little on Guatemala. However, very early on, I found the Tenement Librarian Robert Wagner Labor Archives at the New York University. And I found some unpublished notes from a woman who'd been a girl during the Spanish Civil War and had traveled to Guatemala. I didn't use that material, but just finding it gave me the permission to write the story. I figured if she had come, then other people would have come. And throughout my research, I would find tidbits like that I thought, oh, I'm on the right track. So the coup in Guatemala and the subsequent civil war have been pretty well covered in nonfiction. But the story about land reform and democratic rule in Guatemala hasn't been fictionalized, nor have there been many stories about this racial divide, this sort of apartheid in Guatemala. So I chose to write about that, and I've had many challenges with this book, but I'd like to address 3 challenges I've had with respect to research. And they are with respect to the dictator from the 30s, addressing indigenous people during that time period, and the gay folks during that time period too. So the dictator at the time was a military man named Jorge Ubico, and few people here are familiar with him. He was a tyrant who assembled a vast network of spies and likened himself to Napoleon Bonaparte. He was also a lascivious man who helped himself to women. And it didn't matter if they were married or young. If he wanted them, he took them. And the consequences didn't matter. So through the World Catalog, I found a memoir written by someone who'd worked with him. And I was able to get a copy through the Doe Library at Cal. And I read all kinds of things about him. And there was one story about how he liked to play practical jokes on people. And he once gave an underling some medication for horses, and then just didn't tell the man what he had done, and just watched him suffer. I didn't use that detail, but that tidbit gave me the sense of the kind of cruelty which really helped me write him, and imagine what he was capable of, including some of the information that I did use about about some of his brutality. And when I went to Guatemala a few years ago, I was able to talk to some people who remembered him. My mother had been alive then, but was really too young to remember very much. And when I was there, a woman told me that the mothers, whenever Ubico came to town, and now my novel's set in a provincial town, and the president, Ubico, would come to the town frequently. But the woman told me that, mothers would warn other women to hide your daughters, Ubico's coming. And that just gave me what I needed for my novel. With respect to Indigenous people, I was really challenged by the lack of written materials written by Indigenous people during this time. And I started with the oral history written by Rigoberta Menchú, and after that found oral histories written in the 70s, kind of like hers, where a journalist interviewed her and then recorded the oral narrative of Native men, and they're mostly men whose oral histories I have found. I also found some old ethnology studies by anthropologists who lived in the area during the 30s and 40s. And they would seek contacts within the community and then record information about their findings. And I found a few of those in college libraries that I was able to get my hands on, which were really helpful. I also found, I used Jstor, the online database for scholarly articles about topics during the 10-year period. And those actually served for me as prompts for my writing. I'd find a little detail that seemed pertinent, and then I could, jump off from that point. I also wasn't shy about contacting professors who studied the time periods. I started doing that with Spain, and I found a lot of great resources through contacts. So just the last topic I want to talk about is the question of gay men during this era, which, not surprising, there was nothing written about gay men during this time. So in an attempt to get these issues right, I read some gay literature and tried to extrapolate from them. I read books like Maurice by Ian Forster and Butterfly Boy by Rigoberto Gonzalez. And through the World Catalog, again, I found a text about gay men in Mexico during the 30s and 40s, which I found really helpful. So sometimes you can't find the exact thing that you're looking for or specifically on point, but you can find something that's similar that helps you imagine what it might have been. So as I said before, when I started, I looked everywhere for materials. I looked through databases like Jstor. I found photography books of Spain as well as from Guatemala. And because I was researching a different country, I found that being in the country was just invaluable. I was able to find archives of old photographs, I was able to interview people, and I was able to find books that were written by Indigenous people, books that were written about Guatemala that I had just never heard of, wouldn't have been able to find here. And to supplement my research, on the coup, I read the New York Times. I was able to get, I was able to, back then, look at microfiche of the New York Times. And I've actually found newspapers, Guatemalan newspapers in the basement of the Doe Library at Cal. So all of it, I basically used whatever I could find to help me, to guide me on what I was writing. And I guess one final point about research, which I think is wonderful. It helps for me. It helps me ground me. But you can spend all your time researching, and you might never write if you do that. So I to all folks that are writing historical fiction or nonfiction, don't use research as a crutch. Use it to help you and help you move forward. So that's what I have. I just really appreciate sharing this information with you all.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sara. And how interesting to hear about researching in a different country. So we've gone from fiction, nonfiction, national, international. I'm going to pass it over to myself. Yeah, so Elaine introduced me previously. And let's see, I'm going to share my screen. So the project that I'm going to talk about actually is one that I really primarily worked on while I was, at least initially, at the Mesa Refuge. As you heard, I co-wrote Fred Korematsu Speaks Up with Stan and Biddy Mason Speaks Up with Arisa. This project grew from both of those, but particularly Biddy Mason Speaks Up. So these are both aimed at 8 to 12-year-old readers, more or less, nonfiction biographies. And I became interested in looking at the period around the founding of the state of California and looking at how race was constructed and talked about, and whiteness, to kind of shift towards looking at the kind of establishment of the state and white supremacy. I was also influenced by this. I was a part of this collaboration called Gold Chains, The Hidden History of Slavery in California. And Susan Anderson was a part of this. It was a collaboration between the ACLU of Northern California, the Equal Justice Society, KQED, and the California Historical Society, and looked at the hidden history of slavery in California. And really, that was also around the period of the gold rush and the establishment of the state of California. And of course, race was a part of that. And I helped some with the website that the ACLU of Northern California developed, and learned a lot, including that California's first elected governor, Peter Hardeman Burnett, advocated for Black exclusion and was and for the genocide of Native people. And so I wanted to find a way to get at this information for kids, and decided to focus on the 1849 Constitutional Convention in California. This is the constitution that came out of it. And this took place in Monterey at Colton Hall. And so then the question is, how do you write a book for 8 to 12-year-olds about this topic that's so large? It's still very much a work in progress. I do not have an answer to the how yet, but I thought I'd at least talk some about the research that I did, particularly at the Mesa Refuge. So how did I start? Well, of course, as many of us do, you start with books. And I asked for recommendations. I think Stan recommended this Californian Interpretative History. Luckily, Stan and Elaine had already done a ton of research on this for their book. So I took a ton of books with me to the Mesa Refuge, but of course, you have to find other resources. For me, the internet, of course, for many of us now, is this amazing resource. And I found, and someone asked in the chat about Scrivener. So I'm going to give a little pitch here to Scrivener as an app for organizing your research. And Scrivener, like Microsoft Word, like Excel, you can use it for fiction and nonfiction. A lot of people know about how you can use it to organize your writing, but it's also a really useful way to organize your research, including that you can have PDFs of articles and websites. And so here is the report of the debates from the Constitutional Convention written by J. Ross Brown, where he documented what people talked about. You can keep the PDFs here. You can see I've highlighted things. You can zoom out, so you can actually see like pages and pages of highlight that you have. And then you can also put images, links to websites. It's incredibly useful. So this, through the report, obviously is a way of looking at the language that people used when they talked about issues such as whether slavery should be allowed in California. It was not, but there was an extensive debate around whether Black people should be excluded from the state, the language that people used, who should be able to vote, who should be citizens. So this obviously has been an incredibly useful resource. And actually someone asked about Jstor. I guess this is not through Jstor, but I think Elaine covered that question in the chat. Susan Anderson, I was very lucky during my time at the Mesa Refuge that I was there. This was in November of last year with Susan Anderson, which was incredibly lucky. You'll hear from her in a moment. And she recommended this PhD dissertation that talked about how the southern states worked to try to take power over the Transcontinental Railroad to serve Southern interests, which first of all was something I knew absolutely nothing about. But the dissertation was so full of rich, detailed historical research. And I found in a lot of the research that I've done that PhDs end up being incredibly useful, not just for the research that they do, but then for information in the bibliography about secondary sources and primary sources. So something else, a challenge we often face in research is, and people have spoken to this, finding the kind of juicy details that you can use to really bring something to life. For any age, but for kids especially, it's like you need to paint a picture of the scene. So again, using Scrivener, I've got this little folder here, convention description. So anytime I find some of those, I put them in that kind of document. So you can see here are a few, like, what does the building look like? There was one restaurant in Monterey at the time. What was it that people ate? Was it good? What was the weather like on the day that they finished? So these are the kinds of things, again, I haven't written the book yet, but that are going to be really key to kind of making this alive, a living document. Again, from internet research, I found primary source materials on the internet. This is a pamphlet, The California Indians, a clever satire on the government's dealing with its Indian wards, that was actually written by J. Ross Brown, who had been the reporter during the convention. And I just found this through the search. And again, can keep it in Scrivener as the kind of the scan that you see like a PDF, and also get the text in as just kind of plain text, which is great for searching. So you can search for key terms. Another resource that I've found, and I know all of us have very useful, is newspapers. Many of you probably know about the California Digital Newspaper Collection. They have, like the Daily Alta California, which was one of the first newspapers in California that you can search. You can find originals. And this is an article that was written by these three men, one of whom, Wozencraft, was one of the delegates at the convention and who became one of the first Indian agents. So this was published in the newspaper to report on the work that they were doing. So you get to get kind of the language, the way people wrote at the time, the words that they were using, and how they were representing what they were doing. And just a little kind of then my process as I was working on it, I tend to like visual, hence a lot of visuals here. But while I was at the Mesa Refuge, I just gathered pictures, and you'd think this would be easy. Actually, it wasn't. Of all of the delegates who were there at the convention, they haven't actually been researched in full as that story, at least that I could find. So this was a way to help me connect to the story and look in the faces of the people that I was writing about. I took myself to the beach a few times, I think 4 or 5 times at the Mesa Refuge. The beach is a really creative place for me. And this is a drawing I did while I was at the beach of how I might organize my information. As I did the research, starting to just think, how is this going to work on the page? How is it going to be laid out? While I was at the residency, I put together kind of a little booklet. At the end, for those of you who've been there at the Mesa, had the pleasure of having a residency there, there's a kind of informal sharing that happens where people share their research. And so I shared this kind of little booklet. But one of the things that I did was go to Drake's Beach. That's a picture there on the right, and drew pictures also. And it felt really important, especially given this topic, but in general, to connect to and recognize the people who have lived on this land for thousands of years. The Mesa Refuge is on unceded coastal Miwok territory. And so going to Drake's Beach, doing research about what's kind of on the historical record that may have happened on Drake's Beach or not. And I shared during that informal gathering, kind of, this is what I read, and I thought I'd read part of it now. This is in the red square on the right. Before the first Spanish mission was founded in 1769, most native people on the California coast's only contact with Europeans was to see the sails of their tall ships out at sea. Essie Parrish, a Kayasha Pomo Indian, described these sightings in 1958 to Robert Oswalt, and this is from Kayasha texts, and that's a picture of her there. In the old days, before the white people came up here, there was a boat sailing on the ocean from the south. Because before that, they had never seen a boat, they said, our world must be coming to an end. Couldn't we do something? This big bird floating on the ocean is from somewhere, probably from on high. Let us plan a feast. Let us have a dance. They followed the course with their eyes, saying that destruction was upon them. And I think that speaks to one of the most important resources you can find when you're doing your research, which is primary voices of the people who were affected. And these are hard to find, especially I think all of us are talking about telling stories that are not the ones that you find easily in archives. And I think that's such an important topic. Maybe we'll talk about more, is how to find and find stories, develop stories that are hard to find. And I know Susan's going to talk about that too. So just in closing, one thing that came out of this is that at that final evening, when everybody gets together and informally share, Doris Ober, who's another Mesa Refuge, or a Mesa person who lives in the community, was there that night and heard me read the excerpt that I shared, and she invited me to submit for the West Marin Review. So there will be an article, and Doris said it's going to be coming out before the end of the year. I think with COVID, it's all been a little touch and go, but that will include an article based on the research that I did while I was at the Mesa Refuge. So I feel absolutely honored and delighted to have that connection to Point Reyes Station, a place that I've loved my whole life growing up in the Bay Area. And just being connected to the Mesa Refuge community is a real honor as well. So that is me. And now I'm going to step out of that hat and shift to introducing our last but definitely not least speaker, which is Susan Anderson. So Susan D. Anderson is history curator and program manager at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles. Previously, she was director of library collections, exhibitions, and programs at the California Historical Society, headquartered in San Francisco. From 2017 to 2018, she served as interim chief curator for the African American Museum and Library at Oakland and was a founder of Memory House, a curatorial and public history consulting firm whose clients included the City of Berkeley, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, the Richmond Museum of History, and the Masisi Kunene Museum in Durban, South Africa. Previously, she was a curator in UCLA Library Special Collections and managing director of LA as Subject, hosted by USC Libraries. Susan's book, Nostalgia for a Trumpet, Poems of Memory and History, was published by Northwestern University Press. Her forthcoming book, African Americans and the California Dream, is under contract with Heyday Books. Please welcome Susan Anderson.
Thank you. It was really wonderful to hear everybody's presentations. I think one of the things about being a researcher is that, I don't know, everybody's research is just as interesting to me as my own research. And that's partly how we, get pulled into this, is it's a kind of a pan enthusiasm. I'm on both sides of the of this world. I am a researcher and a writer, but I'm also someone who has spent a long time working in the archives. And I've spent time teaching people how to do research in the archives. And for my subject matter that I'm focused on for my book, African Americans, the history of California's African American history, there's a broad discussion in the field among archivists, historians, people who do research about the whiteness of the archives. And there's stories from famous historians like John Hope, the late John Hope Franklin, who, when he began doing his path-breaking research in the 1950s on U.S. African American history, he was confronted with racist prejudice as he traveled to archives around the country. In fact, he tells a story. He has a famous essay published in 1963 called The Dilemma of the American Negro Scholar, when he described his efforts to view collections at the State Department archives in North Carolina. And he said, "My arrival created a panic, an emergency among the administrators. The archivist frankly informed me that I was the first Negro who had sought to use the facilities there. And as the architect who had designed the building had not anticipated such a situation, my use of the manuscripts and other materials would have to be postponed for several days, during which time one of the exhibition rooms would be converted into a reading room for me." So during the Jim Crow period, this distinguished scholar had to return to a public archive so that it could be racially segregated for his use. And that is part of the history of what we're dealing with when it comes to any kind of collection. Public libraries in the United States, especially in the South, were racially segregated. And we ask, why these histories are not present. Why are we writing histories now to fill in the gaps? And there are reasons for them. For that, if we begin to investigate our past. In addition to what people talk about, the whiteness of the archives, I was talking with a woman the other day who wrote a wonderful little local history of Tuolumne County, out in gold country near Yosemite Valley, and the gold rush, Mining for Freedom, Black History Meets the Gold Rush. And we had a different discussion because we were talking about how we were able to find within archives primary sources, records of the Black presence in California. So sometimes the issue isn't the whiteness of the archives. Often the issue is the whiteness of the people using the archives. And we were asking ourselves, why had so many historians come before us and seen the same primary source material, and yet it hadn't found its way into the narratives about our state's history? What I'm doing, I feel more than anything in my book and in my work in general, is to be a vehicle for the voices in those archives that have been suppressed and ignored. And one of the ways I'm doing that in the book is by privileging primary sources in my book. So when I'm doing research, and say in my chapter on the gold rush, I tell stories, I write about people and events in in Tehama County, up north by Shasta County, and El Dorado County, where gold was discovered, in Coloma, down in San Joaquin County, which is the southern mining region. One of the ways I privilege primary sources as I go to these places. First of all, it's impossible to do the research any other way. No matter what I've been able to find in secondary sources or on the internet or anything else, it doesn't substitute for what I'm able to find on the ground. And also, I want geography to play a role. I want a sense of place to play a role in, as the other my fellow panelists have talked about, those physical details of place to help bring alive the story. Another thing that I do is that I've organized the chapters so that each one opens with a primary source that most people are not going to be aware of, that allows some African-American resident of California to speak and set the framework for the chapter, for what we're going to be exploring in the history. Let me talk about two surprises that I've encountered while doing research for my book. These are two examples of what constitutes my research rapture. And, part of the rapture, I think, maybe for all of us, is this sense of discovery. And it's, discovery is a complicated thing, because you can't discover something that's not there. And if it's already there, it means it's not being discovered. It already exists. So discovery is a process within ourselves. And that is partly where the rapture lies, that we have found something that is new, that's new to us, and that imparts meaning to us in what we're working on. So when I began working on my chapter that deals with slavery and the resistance to slavery in California, in early California, I was, digging around and looking for testimonies from people that would help communicate part of what I was trying to say. And that is that the practice of slavery in California was significant, which is contrary to what other historians have said, whether by their silence on the topic, because for generations there has been a silence on this issue. More recent scholarship has acknowledged slavery, but there's an old argument in California history that says that, African-American population was small. And in a large state with a large population, actually, that doesn't make any sense, because, even a small proportion of a large population is going to be significant. But it's been used as an argument over time to diminish the importance of the history, the standing of the people, and the impact that they had on the development of the state. So part of what I am asserting through the chapter is the significance of California as what another historian called a society with slaves, and to re-look at the state through that lens. And I think I was talking with a librarian friend who had, first of all, I found a footnote, and I think all of us can agree about the power of footnotes, that sometimes a footnote is the first step on a journey through content that can be transformative in your work. So I know that I cannot remember what I was reading, but I found a footnote that quoted a letter that was published in a Pennsylvania abolitionist newspaper in 1850. And that took me on a journey. And then luckily, a librarian friend of mine was able to send me a copy of the Pennsylvania Freeman, which was one of the major abolitionist newspapers in the United States, and a letter from Peter Lester, who was an African-American man who had traveled by ship with his family, his wife, Nancy Lester, and their 3 children, one of whom was named Frederick Douglass Lester, to California. And he arrived in 1850. He had been an active anti-slavery worker throughout his adult life and was part of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. And he wrote to his comrades back in Pennsylvania about his arrival in California and what he was able to see with, his eyewitness of enslaved people. He and his wife and others used to bring enslaved people to their home, and they would sing hymns and talk about freedom and help people escape. And one of the things that he said was, I have found as much work to do against slavery here in California as I ever did in Pennsylvania. So Peter Lester came to my rescue. And the evidence from an eyewitness in 1850 became an anchor for the chapter and also a way of opening the chapter. Because as I said, I'm writing a Black narrative, and I want people to walk through the chapters through the eyes and the witness of the people who lived at the time and what they have to say. Another surprise I also love, and then I'll wrap up after this. Another surprise, and I love the way that disparate things sometimes come together, that, you'll discover one thing, and then several months later, you'll discover another thing. And then several months later, you realize that those two things are connected. And that may be another form of discovery. But making the connection is a form of rapture too, I find. So I had read an article in the Argonaut, which is the publication of the San Francisco Historical Society, that was based, that told a story about the Aspinwalls, who were a wealthy San Francisco family, and their enslavement of a little Black girl about 10 years old named Kitty. And the writer, I actually had conversations with the writer of the article, who's an archivist herself, because I had some questions, and one of them was her conclusion. Kitty escaped, but the writer's conclusion was that she took a boat to Hawaii, and there's something that rang strangely about that to me, and I just wanted to know why she felt that's what went on. Then, based on that article, in the footnotes in the article, I was able to go back to a primary source that's actually very hard to find. It's never been, it's not in any library collection. It's big pieces of a woman's diary, a woman who ran a hotel in the 1850s in San Francisco, were published by the Argonaut. But the diary itself has never been published. But I was able to read long excerpts from it and then get a better picture of the Aspinwall family and the enslaved little girl, Kitty, in San Francisco at that time. And I mean, part of the reason that the girl escaped, she made relationships with the Black community in San Francisco. This was typically what happened, and was able to run away from them. The family brutalized her. And the woman, the white woman who owned the hotel in San Francisco, whose diary I was reading, recorded instances that she saw of especially the wife and mother, Mrs. Aspinwall, physically brutalizing Kitty. So I put that away. I knew I was going to write about Kitty. I had this odd feeling about the boat to Hawaii, and I continued doing my research. And then I remember having lunch with a friend, Melinda McCrary, who is the director at the Richmond Museum of History, telling her about my research on slavery in California. And when she had been doing her museum studies, she registered a small collection that she told me about that belonged to this woman who had been a slave when she was a child. And there was a parasol, there was a dress, there was a small purse, and there was a newspaper clipping. So I was able both to get digital versions of the collection, but then I visited this collection is in the Oakland Museum of California. No one outside of the registrar had ever seen the collection. No one knew it was there. You know, they don't have finding aids for their collection. The only reason I knew about it is because the person that registered it told me about it. So I went to take a look at it, and I have the newspaper clipping. It was written, an article published in the Oakland Tribune in 1939 about Catherine Smith, who was an old lady when the article was written. And she tells stories about being an early resident of the state, about being an enslaved person when she was a child. And I read the article, and then I had copies of it. I got in touch with the Oakland Tribune, wonderful archivist at the Oakland Tribune, and asked them to send me everything about Catherine Smith, which they did with dispatch. So I have an incredible file on this woman who got married, who helped found a church that still exists in Oakland. And I'm reading, I've got the few clippings and I'm reading them. And then one day I'd read this clipping about Catherine Smith about 100 times. And I finally saw what I'd overlooked, that as a little girl, her nickname had been Kitty. And I realized that I'd found Kitty, and that Kitty was not put on a boat to Hawaii, but she was able to escape. She eventually worked for a family, another very prominent family of much better people, made her way across to the East Bay and lived an extraordinary life and became a church founder and the rest of it. So this is a story that has never been told. She was, I knew that it was the same person because there is a story, there's one version of Mr. Aspinwall went to New Orleans and bought her. And she tells the story of being on the auction block as a little girl and having this man whose name she never mentioned purchase her and bring her to San Francisco. So there was in that a kind of rapture because I was able to make the connection. There's also a kind of, a deep grief because I was able to go beyond the abstract and find a real person who was living in the 20th century. And at the same time, her life became a real tribute to her spirit. So I think I'll end there. And I want to say thank you again to everybody.
Wow. Thank you, Susan. That was incredible. I think you brought all the rapture of research in there. So powerful. And what a rapturous experience to be in this group of historians, including all the people who have asked many questions. So I'm going to now hand it over to Elaine to bring some of those questions into the space for the panelists to answer.
Great. I've been monitoring the chat, and we have so many questions, and I hope we can get to many of them because I know a lot of people will want to chime in. So one is, this is from Lyons Filmer. I'm a newbie. How do I find the archives with material relevant to my topics? Does somebody want to start on that? Stan, maybe?
Sure. So I would start with secondary sources. So try to find books, articles about the subject that you're interested in, Lyons, because those, like the footnotes that Susan referred to, will lead you to archives that house primary materials that are related to your subject. The articles themselves, the content will refer sometimes to where they found primary source materials. So that would be the first place that I would start. Anybody else want to add to that?
I would say that even though we have some restrictions because of the pandemic with libraries and archives now, when I work with people to show them how to research, the first thing I tell them is to become best friends with the reference librarian, because none of us do this alone. It's the work of archivists and librarians who make our research possible. So that's the first thing I would say is it could be your branch. You can start with your branch library. Start talking to librarians and tell them, this is what I'm studying. Somebody asked earlier about Jstor. I'll just say something really quickly and then end. Jstor is a database of maybe millions of journals. And this is what librarians do, and this is what they know. They know what the databases are. Some public libraries have more access to these kind of research resources than others. Academic research libraries have access to all of them. But the first thing is to make friends with the librarian and get their help. It will be invaluable.
Thank you, Susan and Stan. And I would just echo both of those things. And also, this happened with us when we were writing Wherever There's a Fight. We would interview one person, say about reproductive rights or about labor history, and that person would then refer us to another person and another person. I mean, we ended up, just widening and widening the circle, and we ended up with probably way too much information. And I'm going to ask a question. Somebody asked about that, but people who are interested in the topic that you are working on will often have thoughts of other people to interview or resources to read. Does anybody want to say anything more about Jstor? I would just want to add to what Susan said, is that, Jstor is this massive archive, and it has a paywall, but usually with a public library card, definitely from San Francisco Public Library, and I know from many others, you can just access it. So the first thing to do would be to check your library and whether that will give you free access to all of Jstor. This one came up from when Sara, when you were talking. How do you organize your research before you know the final sequence or arc of the narrative? And how do you keep from being overwhelmed by sources and possibilities?
I created a notebook just for my research and did a table of contents, that included every. Well, I started doing this. I don't do this anymore, but this is how I kept track of material. The table of contents included each of the sources, and then I would put some notes, of those sources within that notebook. I now use Evernote. Often to if I find material from the internet, and I'll just store it there. And I use that for my work as well as for, my research on my writing. But I mean, I've collected I have boxes of file folders, of material, of articles and, snapshots and what's the flora and the fauna, the particular area that I'm, where my characters are roaming. So, and again, I just create, like a table of contents of what's in there so that I can find it then. It's a rudimentary sort of, I can, if it's on the computer, then I can do a search function and then I can kind of, find what I'm looking for. I'm sure others have more better ways, but that's how I organize myself.
Well, this is sort of relevant, and this is directed to Laura in particular, but it's sort of a corollary to that question. Teresa Ojeda would love to hear more about your process of storyboarding after you decide the research is done. So that is also about organizing research and then getting to the story.
Yeah, right. I'm not quite at the storyboarding stage, so I'm getting there. And actually, if people will bear with me, I'll quickly share Scrivener again, just because I think it can be a way for people to see. Let's see if it works. So, over here, everything's kind of organized on the left, and the manuscript is the actual document. And within it, you can have sections or chapters. So I'll have a person, say like William Shannon, who is one of the delegates. And I'm thinking I'm going to write this in verse, following from the Fighting for Justice series books. But so what you can do here is I can have, within a folder, you can have your poem, and then I have these factual pieces of information and a timeline. So it's just this way of kind of organizing everything. I don't know if this is quite answering the question, but you can also view it in different ways. So there's like a corkboard kind of function with Scrivener. So you can move things around this way, or you can look in an outline and start to see kind of how you're organizing your information. So I guess that's, as a kind of visual person, I stopped sharing, right? I like to kind of see things and be able to move them around. And for me, at least, Scrivener has turned out to be a fantastic way to kind of do everything. You can have your writing there, you can keep your research there, and there's search functions so you can look for keywords. And there's a lot of great videos that they have on the website on particular topics. So yeah, that's something.
I just want to throw in, and Susan, I'm sure, can answer or elaborate on this some more, but once you decide the archive you want to research in, most of them have some sort of finding aid that you could look up online, and then you can type in, search terms that would help you narrow down the boxes or the collections and then the boxes and the files that you might want to look at, so that will save time. And then I just second Susan's recommendation of becoming best friends with the archivist or the librarian, because they oftentimes really know the collections very well and can direct you in the right path to follow.
Here's a question. I'm curious about effective strategies for reading dense and long research texts. How do you read strategically when maybe only a paragraph or section is relevant to your research? Sara, I wonder, because you said you went back into some of those earlier texts about Guatemala. What did you come up with?
I do this. I try to skim at the beginning to see, and try to absorb as much as I can, like what's really going to be helpful. And then I go back when I find, something that I think is pertinent. There's no magic way. I mean, I've spent lots of time, inordinate amounts of time, looking for, things that, I can't find, or, things that books that I thought were going to be promising and then don't end up all that helpful. So, I just recommend skimming from the beginning, looking at the index and table of contents and chapters that appear helpful, and then digging in, more deeper dive.
And I would just add to that, from my experience, like researching the Russian Revolution and especially the Jewish Bund participation, there's a lot of like very dense information about that. And this speaks to kind of the balance between the research and the writing. So, I would try to familiarize myself with the main issues, of course, not to be, to be well versed in it. But once I had the arc of my own story, then I would look for specific things, like the role of the Jewish Bund, or the women political prisoners who were taken to Siberia, or the assassination of Stolypin at the Kiev Opera House, so that I don't have to read the whole thing, but I will get the detail and the information from the points that are relevant to my story. But it is a balancing act, I think, because then you go back and you say, okay, I really need a lot more information about, X, Y, or Z. And so then you have to research some more. But here's another question. Do you offer compensation to the experts or primary sources that you interview? It seems they're sharing a lot of intellectual labor, but that could also add up quickly for the writer. Would somebody like to jump in on that one?
I haven't offered compensation to anyone I've interviewed. I figure in the acknowledgments, if the contribution is significant, that they should be included there. But I haven't done that. I don't know if there's a professional, stance on that, an ethical way to look at that. I don't know. I don't know of people who've compensated, those kinds of contributions.
I'm just thinking, in the research community, it is a community. And, a lot of things come out of relationships, or sometimes relationships are built based on research and work that you're doing. And we're all in the same boat in one way or the other. So I know many, many years ago, in one of my first careers in another life as a journalist, it was unethical to pay people to do interviews, because if you pay somebody, you can pay them to say anything. So, and the principle is the same with research.
Yes. Okay, I think we're sort of running out of time. Several people have asked how to get in touch with some of the panelists. So if you are willing to have your website or your email up, can you put it in the chat, panelists, or your place of work? And then I would just like, on behalf of, I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's question, but I think we covered most of them. Obviously, this is a very rich topic, and people have shared incredible experiences, and I'm looking forward, like Susan, I totally share everybody else's research of Rapture. You know, I'm fascinated by all of your work and look forward to reading your book. So again, on behalf of Mesa Refuge, I want to thank so much our panelists, Susan Anderson, San Yogi, Sara Campos, and my wonderful co-host, Laura Atkins. I want to give special thanks to Kamala Tully and Kira Epstein for your brilliant behind-the-scenes technical support and for organizing and publicity beforehand. And special thanks to Susan Tillett, Executive Director of Mesa Refuge, for coming up with this series from the Gathering Room. And we are going to have another event on December 10th, and I'm going to ask Sara Campos, who is organizing that one, just to tell you a little bit about it.
So December 10th at 1 o'clock, we are going to have Revolutions, Rights, and Movements, Writing the Immigrant Experience, with Roberto Lovato, who's author of Unforgetting, a recent memoir, Cristina Jimenez and Saket Soni, both of whom are Mesa alums. So it would be wonderful to have you all join us then. Thanks.
And you can go to the Mesa Refuge website. There will be a notice put up about that event and how to register, and I hope everybody can come. Also on the Mesa website, there is information about how to apply for residencies. We are going to have residencies in next year, and the application deadline is December 1st. So if you go to mesarefuge.org, I think somebody put it up. Thank you very much, Kira, for putting that up. mesarefuge.org. You will find out, you can click on how to apply, and you will find that. And also, this has been a free presentation today, but if you can help support Mesa Refuge in this difficult time, it would be really helpful to us to make sure that we can continue nurturing voices on the key issues of our time. So if you go to mesarefuge.org, you'll find a donate button, and whatever you can do to help us keep providing this space, we would be most appreciative. In closing, I want to thank you all for coming today and for sharing your thoughts and your questions. Please keep on digging in those archives and keep on writing. We look forward to hearing your experiences about Research Rapture. And now, with thanks to all, I will ask Kira to please close our meeting today. Thank you.